I am Daniel Lakis, and welcome to Book 101 Review. Book 101 is all about the books that I read for the last 40 years. And today, I have my special guest. She is award-winning author of Mammals. I think we are called no other than Miss Giselle Leeb.
Thanks. How are you?
I'm fabulous like you.
Brilliant.
Thank you for having you.
Thank you.
So, can you please introduce yourself more if I miss my intro to about you?
Certainly. Yeah, as you mentioned, my name's Giselle Leeb. I've just had my first short story collection, my debut collection, published by Salt Publishing, and it's called, as you said, Mammals, I think we are called. It's got 18 stories in it. I've been writing for about 12 years, so at least I think 12, 13 of those stories have been published in individual magazines, ranging from literary magazines to sort of alternative horror magazines like Black Static, for example, which is closing. I've been in the Dyslexia, which is a literary magazine for women writers. And I'd say my style is definitely literary, but I probably would be described as cross-genre in the sense that my stories often have scientific or sci-fi, I should say, and fantastical elements, so magical realist type elements in them. So I write with lots of genres. So a lot of my writing is about the future, and I suppose what I'm interested in is how people might change their behavior or how they might feel in the future. So some of my stories deal with that. I also deal with the environment, social media, and possible narcissism related to that, and just other stories about loneliness, world discrimination, and the big question, death, which is sacrifice. So the human condition in the 21st century might be a good way of describing my book.
Sounds interesting, Miss Giselle. So you won the Apprentice Award in 2019. Can you tell more about that?
Yes, absolutely. So the Word Factory Apprentice Award is, well, first of all, I should take a step back. The Word Factory is an organisation that promotes the short story. It's based in London, and it's hosted a lot of brilliant writers. It has events and so on. But what they also have is an Apprentice Award, which means that if you're selected, you'll get a mentor from an established writer. So I was very, very lucky to get Leonie Ross, a writer whose work I really admired. She wrote a brilliant book of short stories called Come Let Us Sing Anyway, and she's published an amazing novel called Poppy Show recently, or This One Sky Day in the UK. Poppy Show is the American and worldwide title. So she was my mentor, which meant I read a fair number of my stories and gave me some feedback. And I had obviously already had quite a few of them published, but it was really very, very helpful in terms of just those really like last. So even when you think you've finished a short story, you can often just take it a bit further. And so I had a great experience with my mentor, and that lasted over a year. I'm also a web designer developer, so I'm still at the Word Factory as an assistant director, helping to organise events and that type of thing. And I also maintain their website at the moment.
So, do you think in writing stories is your stepping stone to write a novel?
Oh, good question. That's the $1 million question. I love writing short stories. I originally tried to write poetry, which wasn't that great, but I might go back to it at some point. I think because I tried to write poetry, it helped me with a sense of rhythm with words. Short stories, I think, is a separate form to novels. I have to admit I'm guilty. I didn't read that many short stories before I started writing them. But like many people, I focused more on reading novels. I've always read a lot my whole life. But one of the best things about writing short stories is I now read a lot of short stories. I was reorganizing my bookcase the other day. It's in a terrible mess, and I had a whole sort of set of shelves just for the short stories. I've got too many books. I'm trying to get rid of some, but it's very difficult. But going back to the short story versus a novel, I think they're different forms, and I've really come to deeply appreciate the short story form. So somebody like George Saunders, who's one of my favorite short story writers, he really got famous in the USA just with his short stories alone. In the UK, a lot of publishers and agents aren't as keen on short stories as novels, so it's harder to get them published. But I don't think they're necessarily a stepping stone. I think they're a separate form, but a lot of people in the UK, to get short stories published, if you've got a novel as well, then you're probably more likely to be accepted by a publisher. But of course, some publishers do publish short stories, and I think often people write novels because they feel they have to write novels, otherwise they won't, get it as big a publisher. But yeah, I think they're separate forms, and I mean, everyone's always saying the short story is reviving and it's dying. It's reviving.
Yes.
Yeah.
Very well said, Miss Giselle. So, mammals, I think we are called. What the meaning of the title of your book?
Mammals, I think we're called, is the title of an actual story, and that's in the book. So it comes from there. And I don't want to give away the ending of that story, but
spoiler alert.
Spoiler, that's absolutely right. So in that story, at some point, it involves a sort of a hare that's quite desperate to be a person. There's also other things that happen in the story, but I think that's one of the main threads about animals and how they, obviously not in real life, but how they sort of kind of disconnected perhaps from humans because they can't talk. That most animals don't have opposable thumbs and they can't pick things up and so on, or defend themselves with weapons. So it's a kind of surreal story, I suppose you could say, in which a tutor goes to war with a hare. So and strange things happen. And that's where at the end, at some point, as I said, I don't want to give away the ending, but yeah, one of the characters says, looks at another character and says, "Mammals, I think we are called," and that's how it came about. Can't really remember why I thought that or said that, but I suppose it's referring to the fact that the animals and the humans share something similar in their history. They're both mammals, or some animals at least, I should say.
Yes. Definitely. So, where did you get your ideas in writing Mammals? I think we are called.
Oh, that's another $1 million question about ideas. Well, I have to say, the one thing I'm not short of is ideas. Getting ideas about everything. So, what I do though is, or what I started to do when I started to write, is to write my ideas down in a small notebook and take it around with me, which really means, I think, to be a dedicated writer, it's a really good idea to do that and not be embarrassed if you have to run off or get out your notebook and write down an idea. Or if you are embarrassed, you can run to a private place perhaps and write it down there. But a lot of the best ideas, I think, just come when you're not thinking about your story or about writing. So often in the shower or just going for a walk or doing, cooking, something will just pop into my head and I'll write it. And Mammals has got 18 stories, so I've got lots of, sometimes they come as an image, or sometimes it's a bit of conversation over here, or I've spoken myself. And the way I write is quite sort of unconsciously, I'd say, or without having a planned structure to start with. So I don't know what's going to happen at the end of my stories when I start writing them. Occasionally I get the ending while I'm writing it, but not usually. So in a way, the idea is just a seed, and then a whole story springs from that seed, but I don't usually know how the story is going to turn out at the end. I've got no idea. And I think I like that because it keeps a sense of mystery. Obviously, as I'm writing it, I will gradually understand, like what's happening, and it's more structure. So it's really to get that first draft, I like to play around a lot and keep things very loose. And so the original idea can change a lot. It's almost like sometimes a feeling, like I just get a feeling I want to describe a certain way of being or something like that, and then I just run with that. I think the one thing I do know, though, is usually when you get an idea which has energy, you can feel that energy. And I always think if you have an idea like that, you should pursue that idea because you know that there's more to it. There's something will come from it, if that makes sense.
Yes, definitely. So, who inspired you in writing Mammals? I think we are cold.
Well, I think my inspiration has come from lots of different places. As I mentioned, I've been a reader since I was a very young child. I was very lucky that my parents, or my mom especially, read a lot of books. So I'm very grateful for that. And I've got a lot of favorite authors. I think in terms of writing the book, as I said, I wrote individual stories. And what inspired me, I'd always wanted to write, but I never thought, I didn't really know how to do it. I thought, well, how do you become a writer? And well, unless it happens spontaneously, it's probably not something that's for you. But I think eventually the book that inspired me to start writing, which then led to these stories, was a book called Becoming a Writer by Dorothea Brand. So I was playing around thinking I'd like to try writing, but I didn't really know how to actually do it. So I read that book, and it's a unique book in the sense that it's not about, how to write, how to edit or plan or that type of thing. It's about why people don't write in the first place. So I read that book, which had a few exercises to do. So I did this. I actually started doing this a couple of years before I really started sincerely writing. Every day in the week type thing. I usually write in the week, not on the weekends. And the books, I got to a point and it said, if you've tried these exercises and you still aren't writing, then maybe it's not for you. And I thought, no, it is for me. And that's when I started writing.
Yes, it's really for you. So, how many months or days you wrote Mammals? I think we are cold.
Well, as I said, I started writing in 2000. Let me think. I think I started writing end of 2009, and I think but basically I started completely from scratch. So when I started, I didn't really know how to even finish a short story. I wrote some very stories which I still love. I feel like for every writer has stories that you write that perhaps wouldn't get published, but it's just a sort of practice. So I suppose you could start. I could say from 2009, I was lucky to get a really short story published at the end of that year, but the next story took 2 years to get published, and then after that my publication rate increased. But so yes, I think when I started in 2009, I decided that every day I would write for 3 hours. First thing when I woke up, I work for myself, so after that I could do my work. I'm quite lucky because I'm freelance, and that's when I really started. But it took a few years, to learn the craft of writing, and it's something that I'm still learning. So I've written a lot more than these 18 stories, and I have had, I think at least, trying to remember, about 40 stories at least published individually. And so I suppose you could say it's been a long process where I've been writing stories and editing them, and it was very, very difficult to select the stories for this collection, but in the end I think I chose stories with a fantastical element. So as I said, it's kind of, they're realistic stories, but perhaps they've got something slightly odd happens, or it might be set in the future, that type of thing. And I've still got a lot of other stories. I'm still writing. I've just finished a couple of new stories, but haven't sent them out yet. And I am thinking also of writing a novel at the moment. Yeah.
Wow, that will be perfect. So how would you craft your writing, Miss Giselle?
Yeah, I would describe my writing as I said, literary. I mean, literary is a kind of, people debate about what's literary, what's not literary, etc. But I think my writing's literary, probably because I do love language a lot and give a lot of attention to language. Story is vital as well. But I suppose I'd say my writing has what people call layers. It's got a lot of layers. It's often an exploration of sometimes of an idea I've had about something, although I don't think writing should ever be, a lecture. It has to be a story. Themes and things you're interested in will come about naturally when you write in anyway. You don't have to sort of write them in. But yeah, I'd say literary fantastical. When you say fantastical, a lot of people think fantasy, but I'm not talking as it's about, goblins and dragons and that type of thing.
Game of Thrones.
Yeah, there's more. I think in the USA there's a really established, much more established tradition of this type of writing than in the UK. But there's a writer called Kelly Link. In fact, that was one of my sort of inspirations. I came across a book which is brilliant called the Slipstream Anthology, and Slipstream is a kind of writing, I suppose, that blends genres like sci-fi, fantasy, and literary. And it sort of describes the modern world. So I suppose you could say that my writing is perhaps does belong to the slipstream category, although again these categories are very disputed. So I guess you could say slipstream, magic realism, fantastical, all of those would describe my writing. But above all, I say literary because it's not really what I write isn't genre fiction as such. It's sort of more mixed genres. I do also write some realistic stories, but they're not in this book because as I said, one of my criteria for the book was to try and hold them together, as a collection. So I chose the ones with a fantastical element.
So do you think there's a sequel for the Mammals? I think they're cool.
Yes, absolutely.
Wow.
I had to very sadly leave out some of my top stories. I've written quite a few stories with apes in them. I don't know why. But, futuristic stories. So yes, I have a story, for example, called Ape Songs, which I was really sad to leave out. It's just a case of having to, choose stories that aren't too similar to each other, I suppose. Yes, and as I said, I've just finished 2 new stories, and I've got a few other stories which weren't included in here. So yes, I definitely see another short story book coming out at some point in the future.
So do you think what will be the title of the sequel of the book?
Oh, that's Mammals. I think we're called too. I'm not sure at this point. To be honest, I think this title, as I said, it came from a story, and actually, it's been a lot of people have liked the title, which I'm very pleased about, including the publisher. But yeah, I don't know what the title will be. I think like with my short stories, at the time I sort of arranged the book, it will probably just, it'll pop into my head if I'm lucky, or I'll have to think a bit about it if I'm lucky. Some short stories, like most of my short stories, the title comes easily, but some of them, like for example, As You Follow, I spent the whole day like really reading through the story and looking at phrases in it to get a title, because that particular one didn't come easily. So
yes. So what is the big difference if you're writing short stories and poetry?
Oh yes, well, I think poetry is far more restricted in terms of form. I think poetry is astonishing in terms of its ability to condense things and to say something, except perhaps 1 or 2 lines that says so much. And I think that's a real inspiration for me for short stories. So with short stories, you really have to try and get rid of, I suppose you could say, all the extra fat, cut it away. When you're writing a short story, when you edit it after, you're really trying to sort of really condense it in not quite like poetry, not as much as poetry, but you're trying to include things which all kind of lead the story on towards its end. So a lot of people would say the beginning of a short story is sort of reflected in the end of the short story. They're quite connected. So when you're editing, you're trying to get rid of those things which sort of perhaps are too far away from that particular story or distract from it, and sort of add things that emphasize it. So with your themes, for example, as I said, I'd never start writing from a theme, but once you've got a first draft, you might read through and try and find out what are the strong themes. Say it was water, for then think, oh, okay, I need some. Are there any symbols or words that reflect that theme, and you can sort of repeat throughout the story? And I think that's similar to poetry in a sense, because poetry is very imagistic. Some people have said my writing is very very imagistic, in the sense of sort of strong images, and also a lot of my stories you kind of jump in right in the middle. You don't start at the beginning and build up. You're just in this different world or in some sort of action. But yes, I think the main thing I've taken from poetry is symbols, and also I wouldn't say my writing's ultra minimalist, but I do like to edit, just a lot and try and sort of essential sentence. I mean, editing's fascinating because sometimes you have a sentence which says, say, three really things really well, but when you take out two of them, the one sentence that's left really shines out, if that makes sense.
So, do you prefer to write short stories or a novel?
Well, I haven't written a novel yet, although I did, as a joke once at a reading, I told someone I tried to write a novel and it ended up being 2,000 words. And then put it in a podcast saying I was writing not a podcast, a blog saying I'd written a 2,000 word novel. It'd be fantastic because then you could probably write a novel every week. Yes, but so I don't know. I think the difference for me, I think the way I write is, as I said, it tends to be like what some writers describe as sort of driving along in the dark. You don't quite know where you're going. And interestingly, I'm reading a book by Haruki Murakami about some essays of his about being a novelist and writing novels. And I'm really enjoying it. And I really love Murakami's style. I've read his short stories, some of his short stories as well. He's got a very relaxed style. And he's talking about writing novels. And the way he does it is he just sits down with his coffee every morning and he sort of thinks about what he's going to do next. And he said for him, it's just this continuous flow, which is very different to some novelists who might plan things and plot out their chapters, and some novelists I know definitely have to plot a lot. Others sort of have a loose structure for the book and then change it. So I think for me, I think I probably will write a novel, but I think it will be on the shorter side. I was very cheered to see recently that in the last Booker Prize there were several incredibly short novels, 100 pages or so. I do like a bit of intensity. So for example, Fahrenheit 451 is one of my favorite books by Ray Bradbury. It's an amazingly intense novel, and he originally wrote it as a short story. I think it was 25,000 words, and he doubled it. So you can sort of get away with 40,000, even with a recent book of maybe 30,000 words. And also, there's a writer called Amanda Schweblin who's translated from Spanish, and she wrote I don't know if you read that one, Fever Dream. It's a novella, so it's shorter than a novel, but it's very, very intense. And I suppose a novella just focuses more on, it has a narrower focus on one thing than a longer novel, which might digress. So yeah, the difference, I mean, short stories, as I said, they all can be very tight. You can't have too much, many sort of asides and so on. Whereas novels, I think you often have more subplots and that type of thing. So I think, in terms of myself, I think when I write, I'm still working out how to write the novel, but I think for me I'll probably work it out. I always like to read a few tips and things, but I think the most important thing is to have something that's interesting enough to you to continue with for a longer time, because that's one of the things I love about short stories. My mind, I get interested in one thing and then something else. With a short story, you can have this burst of interest and energy. You write a short story and then you can move on to something else. Whereas with a novel, you have to stay the course for longer. So I have quite a lot of ideas for novels, but I think in a way, I'll probably just have to try, and some might not work out, some might work out. That's just my way of writing, I think. And it's finding something that's got the real energy to write about for a longer time.
So, does your favorite author influence you in your writing?
Yes. I don't know. I mean, one of my favorite authors when I was going back a bit before I started writing was Kurt Vonnegut. And it's interesting because he writes Slaughterhouse-Five is probably one of his more famous novels. So he's written a lot of novels, and he's got a very surreal, dark humor. And I think he also, when I reread Slaughterhouse years later, recently, I realized how unconventional the structure. I think that's possibly influenced me indirectly. Say someone like Kurt Vonnegut, and Ray Bradbury I read recently. I think he's influenced me a little as well. But I suppose one of the things I was also lucky about was by the time I got to writing, I wasn't really I was never trying to write like someone else because I didn't have any expectations. I thought I'd just try this and see what happens because I always wanted to do it. So I've never sort of felt like I had to write in the style of somebody else, which in poetry is quite standard to write in the style of somebody else and then have your own style. So, but I think yes, both of those authors, perhaps especially Kurt Vonnegut, have probably had a unconscious effect on my writing.
Mammals, I think we are cool. If you describe it, what are they?
Of stories, do you mean?
Yes. Individually, you have 18 stories. 18 stories? Yes. If you describe them in not all of them, but can you give me at least 5 of them that describe the book itself?
Yes, absolutely. I'm just quickly. I've got some log lines, like short descriptions. So yes, I'm just quickly opening those up, and I can actually read those to you because that's probably the best way to do it. So I worked on these when I was submitting the book. I worked on these log lines or short descriptions of the book but unlike a synopsis for a novel, you don't have to give the ending. My last story in the novel, in my collection is called Barleycorn, which is a folk horror story set in the city. So I wanted folk horror is normally set in the countryside, but I wanted it to be in a city, and it's also an environmental story. That one I haven't got a logline for, but just wanted to mention that one because it's one. So yes, I'll read a couple of those. So the very first story in the book is called "The Goldfinch is Fine." It does have a goldfinch in it, and it's the logline is a weatherman reporting on looming environmental disaster finds the courage to come out. So it's got a weatherman who's reporting. So it's got a kind of love story which goes alongside the environmental story. The weatherman is basically has to report on these giant wave coordinates. So in the story, I read somewhere about huge giant waves in the ocean. They're increasing. The likelihood of them occurring was very rare, but now because of sort of climate change, they're happening more frequently. And so the central character in the story is having to report on these what he calls rogue wave coordinates, and he's getting more and more worried about that. Another story called Everybody Knows That Place, and a cyborg visits a reconstructed campsite and experiences strong emotions from his distant human past. So in the story, there's a theme park in the future, and a cyborg, sort of half human, half machine, goes to the park, and the whole park is set up like a campsite. And in this future world, people don't have strong emotions anymore. And I think I partly got that idea from a lot of tech millionaires are trying to sort of not feel things too strongly, and that's related to living a long life. Or at least one who I read about is trying to live a very calm life, so he doesn't expend too much energy. And so that's. But really, it's quite humorous. I think most of my stories have a lot of humor in them, even when they can be quite dark at times, some of them. So he basically visits this campsite, and he starts things start happening that give him terrible frights, and he starts getting more and more scared, but he's not used to fear. And again, I don't want to give away the ending. That story was inspired directly by I do a lot of cycling, and I cycle to once a year at least. I was in Ireland, and we stayed in an abandoned campsite where there was a strange monument. So originally I think I was going to make the story have an alien in it, and somehow that changed into a cyborg in the future. So there's one called Die Vigil. So it's sort of opposite to individual. And I think that was the starting point for that story. I came across that word Die Vigil, which means obviously two. I was quite fascinated by that. And the logline is doctors battle a psychological disease brought on by taking selfies using a radical therapy that shatters identity in order to reshape it. So that story is about social media and its effect on people, and it involves some mirrors, and it's about a sort of future world in which everyone is kind of lost in terms of their identity of self and so on, and they have to go on this strange kind of surreal trip into the past to try and find out who they really are.
Well, sounds interesting, Miss Giselle. And before we go on, I just want to shout out people listening in different places in Spain. Muchas gracias. And in Andalusia, I get 53% audience share. In Madrid, I have 15%. Catalonia, 13%. Valencia at 10%. Mauritia and Castilla de Leon, Galicia, Aragon, Mauritia again, and 10%. So thank you so much for supporting this podcast. I told you that this podcast is created to empower writers all over the world, like Miss Giselle. Where do people buy your book, Miss Giselle?
Yes, absolutely. So yes, as I said, my publisher Salt has Penguin distribution, so you can go into any bookshop in the world and order it. But if you just Google, there's lots of sites in the US, in the UK, in the Netherlands, in I think in South Africa, and the book depository is a kind of site that sends to lots of different countries, like Australia and so on. But yeah, pretty much everywhere in the world. If you just Google it, Mammals, I think we are called, you should be able to find some way to buy it. Obviously, it's also on Amazon. It's on Amazon Japan, I know, and probably other Amazons like Amazon Australia and so on. And
Yes,
obviously, so you can purchase it from a publisher, which is called
yes.
in the UK, and that's Salt Publishing. So like Salt and Pepper, Salt Publishing.
Yes, let's support Miss Giselle. Mammals, I think we are called. I always saying, if we gonna support them, they will give their best. Probably there's a sequel or the Mammals. I think we are called, right, Miss Giselle?
Absolutely, yes.
Yes. So what else you can say about Mammals? I think we are called.
I guess just to finish off, I just want to say thanks very much to you for having a conversation. And in terms of Mammals, yeah, I think it's a really I think that a lot of people enjoy this book. It's got quite a bit of variety in the way stories are told, and yeah, it's as I said, it's got a lot of humor and layers and a bit of sort of also some sort of dark humor as well. And yeah, it's all the stories are quite. Each story is different to the other stories, so it's got a lot of interest in sort of different themes and so on. So yeah, I think it's quite enjoyable in terms of reading those 18 stories.
Yes. My listeners in Book 101 Review, please do listen to my other podcast, Food 101, on my third season. And Food 101 is on the best food podcast on the planet. We are on number 12. And our third season, we are aiming for the top 10 people. So please support us. Listen, Food 101. Food, 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 people. Let's talk about food. And Miss Giselle, you came from South Africa, right?
Yes.
And then you moved to United Kingdom. So, what is the big difference in South Africa in terms of publishing books?
Oh, I think in terms of publishing books, there's quite a few publishers in South Africa, but I think in the UK, there's probably more opportunity in getting a bigger audience, I'd say. So I think obviously South Africa has a lot of writers, some of whom are really doing well internationally, but I think it's easier probably to get published in, or not to get published really, but just to get wider distribution in the UK. So I think a lot of a lot of publisher people might try and. I think you can get a big publisher in South Africa, but I think if you get published by a smaller publisher in South Africa, it might not be as easy to get as much international attention, I think is what I'm trying to say.
So, what is your advice for those aspiring writers out there that want to write short stories or poetry?
Yes, I'd say first of all, make sure you read a lot of short stories, and I'd say that about any form of writing, you need to read a lot in your particular kind of the form that you would like to write in. So if you're going to write short stories, read a lot of short stories by different authors. Read styles that might not be your favorite, a variety of styles, just to get an idea of things, and I think unconsciously you'll get the structure. But I think the biggest tip I've got is just persistence. So as I said, I didn't really know how to write at all when I started, but if you just, I think I got this from the Dorothea Brand book, but if you just sit down at a certain time, if you might a week for 1 hour, or I do five days a week for 3 hours, but you just make a time and sit down and write at that time. So it's a bit like doing exercise. You've got to make a time, and then that takes away all the worry about should I write, shouldn't I write. You are writing, you're just writing at that time, just like you run at a certain time. Sometimes and then just stick to that plan. And even if you write absolute rubbish, it doesn't matter. It's all learning. So I'd say focus on process, not on outcome. So don't think, put all your energies thinking this book's got to be perfect, or this short story, especially not your first short story, because the more you think that, the harder it will be and the less likely. So just enjoy yourself and play around, and don't put pressure. Especially with short stories, you might have to write 10 short stories and then you have an amazing 11th one. It's more about learning to write. And then once you've got those tools, obviously it'll be quicker and easier to write lots of different things or lots of different stories. But it just takes time and it requires practice, just like everything else.
So do you think rejection makes you better in the process?
Oh, another excellent question. Rejection, yes, rejection is part of every writer's experience. While I haven't yet met a writer who hasn't been rejected, there might be one out.
Yes, definitely.
I think rejection, yes, I mean, rejection is just part of it. People have different styles of writing they like, so just because something is rejected doesn't mean that it's terrible, or it just means often that particular person or publication whoever read it might not like it. But the thing about rejection, I mean, it's related to feedback. For me, it's essential to get feedback from people for your writing. So, for example, I joined a feedback group a year and a half after I first started writing every day. I needed to have a bit of time by myself, so without criticism or feedback. And then at a certain point, I joined, read each other's work, and we had a very specific format for it. It has to be friendly feedback, not I hate your story, it's terrible.
Yes,
that can be very damaging for writers. So a kind of positive feedback group. Of course, when people say, okay, this didn't work for me or this worked for me, that's vital. And I think that really helps develop your writing. It helps you to deal with rejection, because when you get rejection, I know some people who get rejected twice, and even people who've done MAs in creative writing and they sort of don't submit again. And I'm amazed. I mean, I think I use Geotrope, which is a submissions manager, and I can't remember. I mean, I used to submit at least, I think, 120 stories a year. I mean, obviously, once you've built up. But, I mean, sending to a place that publishes work like yours, so doing your research and reading that magazine is also good. It means you have less rejection, because the closer you can match what you write to what people want, the less rejection you'll get. But sometimes it's just not their time. Like maybe people aren't interested in the topic at that particular time, and so there's lots of different reasons, to not be accepted. Some people I know don't like stories with fantastical elements in them. They like, hard, what they call dirty realism, and so on.
Yes.
But these days there's so many magazines, especially with online magazines and quality ones, that publish so many different varieties of short stories. So try and sort of target your when you are sending in a story to a magazine or a journal, try and target something that publishes things that you like. When you read it, you think, yes, I like this, and so on. But yes, rejection, don't take it personally. And obviously, if you've got a story and it keeps getting rejected, it's worth having a look, thinking maybe it needs some edits, or asking, whoever you normally ask to read your stories for feedback, to have a look. Stephen King said, he's also got a great book called On Writing, which I'd recommend highly. He said, if you ask, say, 10 people, if 9 out of 10 people say, at this point, when let's say when Daniel said, I'm going outside, I didn't understand what he meant, then you might think I have to fix it. If it's 50-50, the choice is up to you. So,
Yes.
because feedback can also be very different depending on who's giving it. So, yeah, but obviously, if lots of people say there's a problem at this point, you might think, oh, yeah. So, feedback is just really, oh, I don't understand this, or oh, I'm not quite clear on what was happening here. And if everyone's saying that, then you might just want to, to have a look at it again. So, I'd say edit as much as you can before you send out a story. Get work on it as much as you can until it's got to the place where you feel you can't do anything more at that point. You might find in 2 years' time, once your craft has developed, you'll come back and think, oh, I could have done this, but you can only do what you can do at that point. So if you work on it as much as possible yourself, you do send something and you've got a lot more chance of being accepted because the work will be more finished.
Yes. For your own experience, how you handle rejection?
I locked myself in my room and cried for 3 days. That's a joke. Well, recently I did a chat with my mentor, Leonie Ross, and she said I seem very calm with my rejection. But I think the reason is, as I said, when I started writing, I didn't. I was so delighted to get accepted. The first time I got accepted, that's such a thrill when you get a story accepted. And as I said, I didn't have high expectations of myself. So I didn't start thinking I need to be, world famous writer by the end of year one type thing. So actually, I think I dealt with rejection quite well. I think there have been times actually when I've got very, very frustrated, but that was actually later on. I think for me, the most difficult rejections are those type of rejections when you wait for 6 months, 8 months, and eventually you get this rejection, and it's a very personal rejection. So it's like the type of thing would be, oh yes, well, our final committee, all argued about your story, and we didn't agree, so we're not publishing it. So
yes,
I don't say it quite like that, but it's the ones I've had stories. I've had one story in particular, which isn't in my collection, but it got to the top sort of panel, because you've often with these big magazines, you've got first readers, second readers, finally you get this final decision making process, and that story got onto about 4 or 5 of these final panels, and they said, love your story, but but we're not going to publish it. And sometimes that's because one of them was really they had 2 rounds of stories. They had so many submissions. And I got, I think out of a lot of people, I got to the final 10, and then I got rejected. But it's purely because of space or because there's something similar. So yeah, those are the hardest rejections. So I have got encouraged sometimes with a story which I know people like and love, but it just isn't getting accepted. It can be frustrating. But I'd say that's as far as it goes with me, a bit of frustration. But I usually send something out, to another place relatively quickly. After I've been rejected. So I think just keep writing and write other things, and if a story is really good, it will eventually find somewhere to be published, I think.
So Miss Giselle, once again invite our listeners to buy your book.
Yes, so as I said, my book is called Mammals, I think we are called, and it's published by Salt Publishing, a UK publisher. You can buy it on Amazon, you can buy it on the Salt Publishing website, and you can buy it throughout the world from either by ordering it from a bookshop or just by Googling online and finding the sort of the way to buy it in your country. You can often buy a hard copy ebook in most countries in the world, and the Book Depository is a good website which sends books to many different countries, not all countries, but their list is increasing. So have a look on there to see if the book appears on that website.
Yes, let's support Miss Giselle so that the sequel become more better.
Yeah.
As I said, if you support them, they give their best. And thank you, Player FM, for being the number 6 best review podcast. Thank you so much. Thank you, Miss Giselle.
Thanks, Danielle. Thanks so much, and have a good day.
More to come, people. See you soon.
Bye.